So today we're going to be discussing in lesson 2 something called the Midrash. If you've ever studied Torah, and we've gone through perhaps every single class that I've ever given, you might have heard me say the Midrash says, or there's a Midrash that states, there's a story in the Midrash, there's a parable in the Midrash. Let's have a look in the Midrash, what the Midrash tells us. And if you think for a moment, I'm guessing that you can think of a Midrash that you've once heard, or perhaps you've heard me say that term Midrash. You don't recall a specific teaching of the Midrash, but you definitely recall the concept Midrash. And so that's what we're going to understand today. We're going to break it down to understand exactly what is the Midrash, what does the word mean, what is this genre of Torah, and we will give certain examples on how the Midrash works. So what exactly is the Midrash? Is it a specific book? Is it a methodology? Is it a certain style of teaching? And the answer is it's both. It is a methodology, it's a certain style of teaching, and it is also a particular series of books. So before we get into these ideas, let's take one step at a time, and let's first define the word Midrash. Midrash is different than Mishnah, which we will get to, if I'm not mistaken, in lesson 3. We'll get to the Mishnah soon. But Midrash is a Hebrew word, and we will break it down momentarily. The word Midrash means exposition. Right? What's an exposition? To seek out. You're exploring something. It's derived from the Hebrew word drash. Right? Drop the M-I. The Hebrew word drash, that is the root word of Midrash. And Midrash means to seek out. To expound something means to decipher it, to expand it by unpacking what is enfolded within it. So Midrash is the area of Torah learning, which is devoted to expounding the text of the written Torah. Right, like we discussed last week, that what is the Oral Torah? The whole of the Oral Torah is encapsulated within the text of the written Torah in the same way that the entire human being is encoded in a single strand of DNA. And so a Midrashic teaching is a teaching that takes a text from the written Torah and expounds it, extracting from it the laws, principles, and lessons that that text contains. And if you have a look in text 1, there is an important statement from the Talmud explaining exactly this idea on page 58. In Jeremiah, the prophet says, "My words are like fire," says God, "and like a hammer that shatters a rock." As the hammer explodes many particles, so does one verse of scripture diverge into many teachings. What does that mean? You see, the principle behind this style of study, of Torah study, behind Midrash, is that every verse in the written Torah incorporates many layers of meaning. The outermost layer of meaning, the simple text, is when you read a verse and you have the simple meaning of those words. That's what's called pshat. Simplicity, right? I say what I mean what I say, that exact words. When I say hello, I mean hello. That is the simple, most outer layer of the text. But that's only the outer layer of the text. Midrash is the process through which we penetrate the outer layer of the text, and we seek out and expound the additional layers of meaning contained within the words or between the lines of the written text. And we'll get to many types of examples shortly. See, there is a number of different types of Midrashic teachings. If you look on page 60, you'll see various types of Midrashic teachings. There are Midrashic teachings which are, or let's split it into two categories. And if you look at on your fold-out card, you can see it there as well. So either on the fold-out card or on page 60, we can break it into two general categories. There are Halachic Midrashim. Midrashim is the plural for Midrash. And there are Agadic Midrashim. You see, we said Midrash is a methodology, a certain style of Torah study, and that is expounding the written text. And then Midrashim is also a collection of books that contain within it teachings of this style. And so within those books, there are two general categories. There's a style of Midrash which is called Halachic Midrash. These are Midrashim, the plural, expounding upon the text to understand the legalities of the Torah, the laws, the details of the 613 commandments. Deriving from the written text of the written Torah, various details of various laws, or all the details of all the commandments of the Torah. And then there is a second subset of Midrashim called Agadic Midrashim. Agadic Midrashim is, you see, Agadah is the general name which is given to non-halachic teachings of the Torah. What are non-halachic? Halachic teachings are details of the laws, prohibitions, the obligations that we all have. Then there are non-halachic teachings of the Torah, the moral teachings, the philosophical teachings, the historical teachings, the mystical teachings. They definitely have an effect on one's behavior, but they aren't the details of the law itself. And so these are the two categories that we will address today. And if you look at page 60, you'll notice that there's various types of Midrash. And just to point out a few, the first one is legal exposition, which is the Halachic Midrashim, going through Halachic Midrashim is going through details of each mitzvah, and we'll see some examples of that momentarily. Following that, we have historical narratives, stories of the Torah, which the Torah does not give us the complete story, but the Torah does hint to various aspects of the story which are part of the oral tradition, and the expanded edition, so to speak, is recorded in the Midrash. For example, the history of Avram Avinu, our ancestor, the history of his first 75 years. The Torah does not record anything explicitly. It begins when he is 75 years old, more or less. I mean, it says a couple of verses, but from those couple of verses, the Midrash expands and expounds upon it, the traditional methods of Torah exposition, and it records via that and oral tradition the details of the historical narratives. Then we have moral and ethical teachings of the Torah, which are non-legal teachings that give us guidance on proper behavior and attitudes. And these are also derived from biblical text and narratives. Following that, we have the philosophical teachings. Various parables are contained within the Midrash, also associated with a verse of the written Torah. Then we have the Torah commentary, which are explanations of the biblical text and narrative. And many of these Midrashim are the sources for later works of biblical commentaries. For example, like our most favorite commentary, the commentary of Rashi, and other commentaries. And finally, we have the lives of the sages, various stories from the lives of the sages contained within the Midrashim, which give us certain historical aspects of that era of the Midrashim themselves. Now, like we said earlier, there we are. Like we said earlier, Midrash is a reference to two things. It's the style of learning, which we will actually experience that style in a few minutes. And then it is the volumes within which this style of learning has been practiced by the sages of ancient and recorded in these specific volumes. And so to give us a general overview of this second way, the Midrashim, which is the volumes within which these teachings are recorded, we have a short video here that gives us a pretty good overview of the major works of Mishnah that we have until today. So here we go.
Welcome to the branch of Torah study known as Midrash. Midrash comes from the Hebrew verb drush, to seek out or expound. It refers to the effort to explore, explain, and expound on the Torah. It is also the title of an entire genre of literature generated by Mishnaic and Talmudic sages, the phenomenal Jewish scholars who lived roughly between 100 and 500 CE. Midrashic literature comes in two forms. One, halachic. These works document the intricate methods used to analyze the typically terse biblical texts containing the Torah's 613 commandments. The goal of a halachic midrash is to show how the detailed laws governing the practical observance of those commandments are derived. Two, agadic. These works provide a wealth of explanation of biblical texts and narratives, parables that clarify or illustrate a point, moral and ethical teachings, philosophical insights, mystical traditions, historical narratives, and background information not explicitly recorded in the biblical text, and stories from the lives of the ancient sages. Much Midrashic material was lost in the upheavals of Jewish history, but the surviving works form a library of their own. Here are the major Midrashic works still in existence, including later era anthologies in chronological order. Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer explores the biblical events from the creation until the Jewish journey through the Sinai desert. It is attributed to one of the Mishnah's most prominent sages, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael preserves expositions on the book of Exodus that were taught in the academy of Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. Mechilta de Rashbi offers expositions on the book of Exodus from an alternative academy, that of the much beloved Rabbi Akiva. Its recording is attributed to his disciple, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous author of the mystical Zohar. Seder Olam, meaning world chronology, chronicles biblical and post-biblical history from creation until the 2nd century Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans. It is attributed to Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta of Sepphoris. Sifra provides key expositions on Leviticus, which focus on Kohanim, Jewish priests who served in the temple. The work is also called Torat Kohanim, the laws of the priests. Its partner volumes on the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy are known collectively as Sifri. The insights in these volumes were taught by the school of Rabbi Yehuda, a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. Maimonides identifies the Talmudic sage Rav as the compiler of Sifra and Sifri. Midrash Rabbah is a series of 10 separate works that provide textual expositions, historical narratives, and moral teachings structured as commentaries on the 5 books of Moses and the 5 scriptural scrolls: Song of Songs, Ruth, Esther, Lamentations, and Ecclesiastes. These anthologies were compiled between the 3rd and 12th centuries and record teachings of Talmudic sages from the land of Israel from the 3rd and 4th centuries. Midrash Tanchuma is a foundational book offering expositions on the 5 books of Moses. It is named after a 4th century author heavily quoted in the work, Rabbi Tanchuma. The Talmud is not an exclusively Midrashic work, but its legions of volumes include a vast treasury of Halachic and Agadic Midrashic material. Midrash Tehillim offers commentary on the book of Psalms. Its era of compilation is unknown, but it is cited in works as early as the 11th century. Yalkut Shmoni, a voluminous Midrashic anthology covering all 24 books of Tanakh, was compiled by Rabbi Shimon Hadarshan of Frankfurt, Germany. Midrash Hagadol is an anthology attributed to Rabbi David bar Amram al-Adani of Yemen. Ein Yaakov, an extraction of the Agadic sections of the Talmud, was compiled by Rabbi Yaakov ibn Habib of Spain and Greece. The sheer number of surviving Midrashic works spanning 15 centuries testifies to the Jewish scholar's remarkable commitment to identifying and expounding the wisdom and guidance contained in God's Torah.
So we got a general overview of the existing major Midrashic works that we have. Now, just want to give a further overview that, see, the Oral Torah spans some 3,300 years from the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai in the year 2448, 1313 before the Common Era, until today. And it's a process that began from when Moshe Rabbeinu started teaching the Jewish people in the desert up until today. Up until every person, including us, who are sitting here and toiling to understand the various aspects of Torah. Nonetheless, if you look in the fold-out card that you have, or in the spread on page 62, you'll notice the time frame of the Midrashic period spans a short amount of time, roughly about 600 years, from the 100 years before the Common Era until roughly about 500 rather, of the Common Era. And the reason for that is fairly simple. You see, for about 1,200 years from the revelation of Torah at Sinai, the Oral Torah was exclusively oral, as we touched upon last week, and we'll discuss it more at length next week. But it was exclusively oral from the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai in 1313, roughly until 100 before the Common Era. Now, what happened at year 100 before the Common Era, we'll discuss it next week. But as a result of what happened, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, decided to transcribe the Mishnah, work on transcribing, began the documentation process of the Oral Torah, and it culminated with, it didn't begin, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi didn't begin in the year 100 before BCE, but it culminated with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's editing of the Mishnah near the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era. So near the end of the 2nd century, about 1,800 years ago. Therefore, the earliest Midrashic works were compiled in those years, in the 1st century, in the 2nd century, and they recorded compositions and expositions, they recorded expositions as they were taught by the sages in those prior 3 centuries, expounded upon and discussed in those 3 centuries. Now, there are later Midrashic compilations which record sages of the Talmudic sages, and that's compilations of the era of year 200 through 500, from the 2nd through the 5th centuries. Following the 5th century, we do have some Midrashic compilations. We do have some Midrashim, but these teachings of sages following the 5th generation, following really the 5th century, following the completion of the Talmud, do not have the same level of authority as those sages who lived before the completion of the Talmud. More on that next lesson. Therefore, while some of the Midrashic compilations were compiled after the 5th century, they all record teachings of Torah sages who lived and taught in the centuries before the closing of the Talmud, before the 6th century. And this is particularly the case with Halachic Midrashim, because the Halachic works authored by the sages who lived after the closing of the Talmud, they concern themselves with discussing, codifying, and expanding on the laws expounded upon in the Torah and the Halachic Midrashim, rather than with deriving laws themselves from the biblical texts. There's nothing new in those halachic midrashim following the 6th century. Now, as far as Agadic midrashim are concerned, Agadic teachings, later sages did author non-halachic expositions of biblical verses, but nonetheless, the term midrash is generally reserved for expositions by the sages in the era of the Mishnah and the Talmud. Generally speaking, when we discuss midrash, when we talk about midrash, when Torah sages hear the word midrash, or your average Jew who has studied Torah hears the word midrash, what comes to mind is the Agadah component of the Midrashic literature. What's the Agadah component of Midrashic literature? The stories of our history, the stories of those sages, the narratives, the parables that we are so familiar with from various sources. Take, for example, the famous Midrashic account of Abraham's father and how he was an idol worshiper, and how Abraham went and destroyed the idols of his father, and then told him a whole story of how that whole entire history that we've recounted here a number of times is a famous midrash. And that's kind of what comes to mind. And also the story of Cain, and how he was killed, or how he began the process of his punishment by killing his grandson by mistake, and various other stories that we are familiar with. The Midrash is packed with these fascinating stories and mysterious parables, which encapsulate and include within them tremendous teachings and lessons. And it's obvious why these are the most memorable parts, and these are the parts that come to mind immediately, is because stories capture our imagination. They stimulate our curiosity. They're wild, they're exciting, they're fascinating. But the reality is, Halachic Midrash is equally fascinating. Because at the end of the day, Judaism is primarily about halacha, about law, about how we go about the business of life, the day-to-day life. And it's fascinating to see how the practices of everyday Jewish life are in the text of the Written Torah. We're going to explore a number of these halachic midrashim in today's lesson. But before we do that, we'll spend a few minutes looking at some examples of the Agadic aspects of the Midrash, and it'll give us a little bit of a taste of these aspects of the Midrash. Let's begin with our first Midrash of tonight. That's on page 64, text 2. Here's where it gets exciting. It's a fascinating parable. You may have heard it. You may have thought about it. You may have even recounted this parable not knowing that it comes from the Midrash. So the source of this, as you can see, it comes from the Midrash called Bereshis Rabbah, the great Bereshis. It's the Midrash, one of the earliest Midrashim. And it's right there on your fold-out card as well on the top line to the left. You can see it says Midrash Rabbah. What does this Midrash say? The Midrash reads as follows. When iron was created, the trees started trembling. Said iron to them, "Why are you trembling? If no tree among you enters into me to provide a handle for my blade, not a single one of you will be hurt." That's the parable that the Midrash relates. That's it. That's the beginning. That's the end. What is this Midrash telling us? So the parable, the general concept of a parable, is an age-old method of teaching in all disciplines and cultures, and we employ it all the time. We give parables, examples, metaphors, you name it. But let's take the parable narrowly. Take this parable, right? The sages could have simply stated that divisiveness within a community makes all its members vulnerable to an attack by their enemy. Right? But if they work together, then it doesn't work. Then they're stronger. Instead of telling us this message clearly, the sages chose to convey this idea by a means of a dialogue between the frightened trees and the newly created iron, and with the image of an axe with its iron blade and its wooden handle. Why? Why would the sages do that? Why would the sages teach us this idea? Instead of saying it clearly in clear words, teach it to us with a parable. And the simple answer is, because when you tell something with a story, as every parent, every teacher, every human knows, when you tell something with a story, it's a lot more effective. Stories are entertaining. Stories are personal. Visual images, scenes make a stronger impression on us. And so if you teach an idea through a story, we relate to it a lot quicker and a lot deeper. But these are not the only reasons why parables are a useful tool for teaching. Certain ideas are too abstract and too complex to be communicated through the language of conventional, logical explanation. And if one attempted to communicate those ideas, it'll take pages upon pages upon pages, many volumes, many hours of explanation to teach all the intricacies that this parable may be related. The only way to communicate such complex and esoteric ideas is through a parable. Why is that? What happens with a parable? In a parable, the idea is disguised and packaged as a story. The story itself, readily understood. Understand the story, the iron, the trees, it's all understood. The message it contains may still be a mystery. When a person understands the story, they understand the story. They may not understand the message it contains at first. When you study and analyze the story, suddenly the message shines forth. Ah, I get it. But you know what happens? The more we study the parable, the more we see another layer, another facet, another aspect, another teachable item that we glean from the parable. Layer upon layer upon layer that perhaps would have taken years to communicate from a teacher to a student. The teacher communicated with one simple parable, and the student is still deriving lessons from that parable years later and perhaps generations. Because every time we come back to it, we uncover a new layer of meaning. And you know what? We may never uncover the full depth of the meaning in the parable. But guess what? We already possess it all because we know the parable. We only need to unpack it. And the same is true with the ideas embedded in the parable. The story was absorbed in our mind. It's now ours to continue to probe and to unpack. And this is actually what Rabbi Shneur Zalman Abdiyadi, he writes in a letter to his Hasidim that every single day, every evening between the afternoon and evening services is a short period of time, half hour, 45 minutes. And so traditionally, Jews in a synagogue in the morning prayers takes about 45 minutes, just a morning prayer, an hour, give or take. And then people go on their day. So there's no time for Torah study. But in the evening, people get home from work. They go to synagogue and they do the afternoon service. We'll say on a winter day, on the summer day, the afternoon service is about 7:45. The evening service and the afternoon service takes about 10 minutes. So you're done by 5 to 8. The evening service can't be prayed until about 8:30. So what do you do from 7:55 until 8:30? You're not going to go home because by the time you go home, it's going to be time to go back to the synagogue already. So traditionally, Jews stay in the synagogue, and it happens till today. Most synagogues, people don't leave the synagogue between the afternoon and evening service. So what do they do in that half hour? They sit and they study Torah. either collectively, the rabbi teaches, or one person, there's a group, break into various little groups. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi told his Hasidim in a letter, he writes that what should they study in this half hour? They should study Ein Yaakov. Why Ein Yaakov? What is Ein Yaakov? Ein Yaakov is a work that anthologizes the Agadic teaching of the Talmud, the Agadic teachings of the Talmud. It's a collection of the Agadic Midrashim of the Talmud. So it takes out all the Halachic Midrashim, it takes out all the, and it's just the Agadic Midrashim of the Talmud. Why should they study that? Text 3. Most of the esoteric wisdom of the Torah is hidden in the Agadot, in the book Ein Yaakov. Because again, once you have the parable, you have all its teachings, all its esoteric levels. You just got to learn it again, learn it again. And each time you study it, you'll glean another message. That is the reason why many Midrashic passages in the first reading seem very strange and mysterious. It's only when we delve deeper into them that we discover the ideas and the insights that they contain. And here comes the second Midrashic teaching of tonight, which is perhaps falls into that category where it's a Midrashic teaching that seems a little mysterious and strange, but as we let it percolate in our mind, we will see the tremendous lesson contained within it. Let's have a look at text 4, page 66. Here's another Midrash from Bereshis Rabbah, the same Midrash that we quoted earlier, a few chapters later. And the Midrash relates the following parable. It is written, and God said, let us make a human. Right? What does it mean, let us? So the Midrash says, with whom did God consult? Said Rabbi Simon, when God came to create the first human being, the ministering angels formed different factions, different parties. Some of them said the human being should not be created, while others said the human being should be created. Thus it is written, kindness and truth encountered each other, righteousness and peace abutted. Kindness said, create them, for they do acts of kindness. The truth said, do not create them, as they are full of lies. Righteousness said, create them, for they do acts of righteousness. Peace said, do not create them, as they are full of quarrels. What did God do? He took truth and hurled it to the earth. Thus it is written, you cast truth to the ground. Said the ministering angels to God, Master of the world, why do you insult your signet? Because it says elsewhere that God's signet is truth. Said God, may truth rise from the earth. Thus it is written in Psalms, truth sprouts forth from the earth. Now take a moment to examine this Midrash. This parable that the Midrash relates. Think of an idea the Midrash could be trying to teach us, impart to us. And I'm sure if you examine it, if you take a moment, you'll have an idea that comes to mind what this Midrash could be telling us. And I'm sure if we went around and had everyone share what they came up with, it'll be something different. And the more you examine it, the more ideas and lessons we can glean from this Midrash. What is clear is that this Midrash is addressing some of the big questions of life. Why did God create us? What is our purpose in life? What is truth? Where can truth be found? Is peace ever attainable in this world? And many, many such questions. This Midrash is clearly addressing these questions. But what exactly are the answers to these questions that the Midrash is imparting to us? Are there clear answers in this Midrash? The answer is obviously yes, but let this Midrash percolate in our minds. Let's put it on the back burner for a moment, and we'll get back to this Midrash at the end of today's lesson. Before we get back to this Midrash, and for the remainder of the lesson, we're going to familiarize ourselves with how the Midrash works. It's an exercise, mind exercise, to give us an understanding on how the Midrash works. How did the sages in the era of the Midrash, back 100 before the Common Era up until 200 of the Common Era, and then onward until the end of the Talmud at the end of the 6th century, how did the sages extract laws, principles, and teachings from the written text? What methods did they use? So we'll begin with another quote from the Midrash in text 5, on page 68. These are the laws that you shall place before them, says the verse in Exodus. Rabbi Yishmael says, these are the 13 methods by which the Torah is expounded, which were given to Moshe at Sinai. And let's call these 13 methods the Midrash methodologies. What are the Midrash methodologies? They are 13 methods that were given by God to Moses at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, that formed really one of the most important aspects of the Oral Torah transmitted from God to Moshe at Mount Sinai. These 13 methods and the manner in which they are applied were transmitted and passed down from teacher to disciple, beginning from God to Moses through the generations for those 1,300 years until they were recorded in Mishnaic and Talmudic literature. These 13 methods are the only ways with which we can expound Halachic Midrashim. And these are the 13 methods which are used by the sages throughout the Talmud, throughout the Midrashim, to expound upon the written text. These are the system, the methodology which God gave Moshe to expound the written text. We're not going to analyze all 13 because that'll take up many, many hours, but we will analyze 4 of the 13 tonight, and we will analyze an example of each one of these 4. And most of the examples that we use will be from Halachic Midrashim, details of laws that we're familiar with up until today. Have a look on page 69, or you can just look here on the screen. These are the 4 methods that we will address today. The first one is called Kal V'chomer. That is the Talmudic name of this method. Really, loosely translated, is logical deduction. And we'll see examples what exactly that means within this framework of the Talmud, of Halachic Midrashim, of this genre of Torah. The second method we'll be addressing today is called Riboy Umiot, loosely paraphrased and translated is textual exposition. The third one we will address, the third method, is called Hekish, or Gzeir Shava, or Smichos. All 3, these are 3 different aspects within this same method called association. And the fourth one is Kri Uksiv, alternate readings, which perhaps we may relate to most within the English language as well. And we'll get to that at the end. So let's begin with the first one. And we are on page 70. The first way that Midrashic sages, the Talmudic sages, the Mishnaic sages, analyze the Torah is with the method called Kal V'chomer, logical deduction. What is logical deduction? Logical deduction is when we deduce one concept from another by logical means. In other words, if A is true, then B is certainly true. In Latin law, that's called an a fortiori argument. Correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. A fortiori. And a classic example appears in the book of Genesis, the famous story of Joseph and his brothers, a little background of Joseph and his brothers. What happens to Joseph and his brothers, right? Joseph is the viceroy in Egypt. They don't know that he is Joseph. They think he's just a ruler in Egypt who has control of over all the storehouses of food. The brothers want to get food because they need food because there's a famine. So they go south from Israel to Egypt to get food, and they pay lots of money for that food. They get their bags of food, they leave Egypt, and now they're traveling back northward, back towards Israel. They stop at an inn, and they notice that all the money that they had paid for their food was replaced, was put back into their sacks. And so the second time they go back to Egypt to get more food a few months later, they bring back that original money that they had paid for the first round of food, plus extra money to buy a second round of food. And they come to Egypt and they get more food, a second round, and they give back the original money, plus they pay more money to get the second round of food. And they leave. And guess what? What do you think they found in their sacks after they leave Egypt? On their way south, northward, back to Israel. Again, they find their money that they just paid for their food. It was placed back in their sack. But not just that. They are accused of stealing Joseph's cup. So they come back to Joseph, and they say as follows. This is in text 6 on page 70. What do they tell him? Behold, the money that we found in the opening of our bags, we return to you from the land of Canaan. How then would we steal gold or silver from the house of your master? This is a kal v'chomer. This is a logical deduction. In other words, what they are saying is as follows. Kal v'chomer literally means lenient and severe. And the argument goes like this. If in the case of a more lenient scenario, in other words, returning the money that was placed back in our bags, the brothers did not take the money that did not belong to them, then certainly they did not do so in a more severe scenario, actual theft of Joseph's cup. In any one of these steps, if you have any questions or if you're not following, then please let me know in the chat box. So I'll explain it in different words. But once again, just to repeat. So kal v'chomer means lenient and severe. What's the argument? The argument is, if using this story of Joseph and his brothers, if in a more lenient situation, in other words, returning the money that was actually placed back in their bag, they're returning that money, then of course they didn't do in the more severe, what's suspected of them, in the more severe scenario of actual stealing the gum. How does this apply to, right? And we use this type of argument all the time. In other words, we use it, it's a very logical argument. Now, how do you suspect me of doing A if I didn't do B? If I didn't do B, then of course I didn't do A. Because A is much more severe. So if I didn't do B, then of course I didn't do A. Or vice versa, B is more severe. So if I didn't do A, then of course I didn't do B. Either way, how do we apply this to biblical law, to law of Torah? So we're going to use an example. Let's call it the roadside assistance law. Yeah, roadside assistance nowadays means you call AAA when you have a flat tire, or you call the company if you have a lease, or you call your insurance, Geico, whatever insurance you have. You call them up and they come within an hour and they fix your tire, they change your battery, your oil, whatever you need done on the side of the road, right? What was roadside assistance 2,000 years ago? Donkeys. So what does the verse tell us about roadside assistance? Let's have a look. Text 7. When you see the donkey of your enemy collapsing under its burden, and you are inclined to desist from assisting him, you must assist with him. Right? Reading this verse, it just seems like a confusing way of saying, if you see a donkey collapsing, help it. Right? So what's the verse telling us? The verse is telling us as follows. You're walking down the street, and you see a donkey that collapsed under the load it's carrying. The Torah is telling you that you are obligated to stop whatever you're doing and help the owner of the donkey unload the donkey's burden so that it can get back on its feet. It's actually one of the 613 commandments. Very simple, very straightforward. What's interesting over here is the wording which the Torah chooses to teach us this lesson. First of all, what does the Torah say? When you see the donkey of your enemy collapsing under its burden. Hold on. Only if I see the donkey of my enemy? How about if I see the donkey of my friend? My friend. I mean my friend, my good friend Yankel, and I see his donkey collapsing. The lawyer in you would say, no, the verses tells you it's only the donkey of your enemy you have to help, not the donkey of your friend. Right? So if I'm walking and I see my enemy and he's walking with his donkey and his donkey is collapsing under the burden, then I have to go and help him. But if I see my friend and his donkey is collapsing under its burden, I could just run away. I don't have to help him. Is that really what the Torah is telling us? So this is where the argument kal v'chomer, this is where the method of kal v'chomer of logical deduction comes in. What's the logical deduction here? Very straightforward. If you're obligated to assist your enemy, then certainly you're obligated to assist your friend. Right? Kal v'chomer. If it works in something which is more severe, then of course it works in something which is more simple. So that's how we employ kal v'chomer, the law, the method of deducing the law of Torah, is that this law of Torah is actually telling us it's not just your enemy, it's also your friend. So then you might ask, why didn't the Torah just tell us that? Why did the Torah have to say in such a backwards way that if you see the donkey of your enemy, and we have to employ the method of logical deduction to deduce that it's not just your enemy, it's also your friend's donkey. Why didn't the Torah just tell you from the get-go? If you see a donkey, and we would have known it's your enemy and your friend. So here's where another rule of logical deduction comes into play. And this rule is called dayo. But dayenu? Similar root word. What is a dayo rule? The dayo rule is as follows. Text 8. This is straight from the Talmud. It is enough that a matter derived from a law should be as strong, but not stronger than the source law. What does this dayo rule mean? Dayo means it's enough, and that's actually the meaning of dayenu. It also means it's enough for us. Dayenu just has that suffix which adds it's enough for us. But dayo and dayenu both means the same thing, which is it's enough. What is the dayo rule? The dayo rule is saying as follows. If B is derived from A, then B cannot be stronger than A. How does that apply to the roadside assistance law? Simple. If you're walking on the street and you see two collapsed donkeys on the roadside, one donkey belongs to your enemy and the other belongs to your friend. Who do you help first? So logically, you may say, what do you mean, who do I help first? I have equal opportunity here. I have an equal opportunity to help my friend or my enemy. Of course, I have to go and help my friend first. That would be my obligation. First, I help my friend, and if there's time, I go help my enemy. If it's not too late, if the donkey didn't collapse or the donkey didn't, pass out, I first go and help my friend. This is where the dayo rule comes in. Because the Torah chose to state the obligation to unload your enemy's donkey explicitly, and your obligation to unload your friend's donkey is derived from that law by the means of logical deduction of kal v'chomer, this makes the obligation to help your enemy the source law, and the obligation to help your friend, the derived law. And therefore, the derived law cannot be stronger than the source law. And so if you see your enemy's donkey and your friend's donkey, they are of equal importance. Because you can't say, I have to go and help my friend first, because that would be making helping your friend unburden his donkey stronger than the source law. And it cannot be that it's stronger than the source law. So the Torah is telling it to us in such a fashion, because the Torah wants to teach us this, that both your enemy's donkey and your friend's donkey are both of equal importance. And as a matter of fact, the Talmud says, continuing in this law, the Talmud actually says that by logical deduction, we come to the conclusion that both are equal, enemy and friend's donkey. Nonetheless, the Talmud says a person should first help unload their enemy's donkey to overcome their evil inclination. So that's kind of taking it a step further. That's not straight law. Straight law is that they are both of equal importance. So this is an example of this rule, logical deduction, kal v'chomer, and with its subcategory of law, the Dayo rule, which is a very important rule throughout Talmud. This is how the sages derive details of this law. And it's right there, it's in the verse. The verse is telling us and teaching it to us in such a seemingly backward manner because it wants to teach us added details. And this is not the only detail. The Talmud goes to great lengths to analyze this verse and deduce more details from this verse using this methodology, using other methods to deduce more details. Let's move on to the second Midrashic method, which we listed earlier, which is textual exposition. And we're going to remain with this story of the donkey. So let's hold our horses, hold our donkeys here. What's textual exposition? Textual exposition is a set of Midrashic methods that examines the wording of a verse to note the particular choice of wording, seemingly the presence of extra words or even seeming extra letters, a repetition of certain words, repetition of certain phrases, and deduces from these variances additional layers of meaning contained within the text. So let's take another look at the verse that we quoted earlier about the rule of the roadside assistance, which, as I mentioned earlier, is an actual law in the Torah. It's one of the 613 commandments, right? What does the verse tell us? Here's the written Torah. When you see the donkey of your enemy collapsing, we now know why the Torah says the word your enemy, which is seemingly a superfluous statement. But we already expounded on that text in the Midrash earlier that we quoted earlier through the kal v'chomer, the logical logical exposition, logical deduction, excuse me. Now we're going to move on. When you see the donkey of your enemy collapsing under its burden, and you are inclined to desist from assisting him, you must assist with him. There's a number of grammatical glaring issues that we would call. Obviously, there's no issues in the Torah. It's written by God, but there are a number of things that grammatically don't add up, and it doesn't add up in the Hebrew as well. It's not just a bad translation here. It doesn't add up in the Hebrew as well. It's as confusing in the Hebrew as well. First of all, why does the Torah give us this double term? Assist, you must assist with it. Why can't the Torah just say assist? Finished. One word. Secondly, why does this have to say assist, you must assist? Just say assist with him. Second of all, why with him? Why can't it have simply said you must assist? What's the double repetition? Assist, you must assist, and with him, what does it mean with him? So the sages explain as follows. Text 9, page 72. Assist you must assist. To what extent does one have to offer assistance? The fact that it says it twice teaches us. Aziv, taziv, assist, you must assist. In other words, says the Talmud on page 72, if one unloaded and reloaded, and each time it kept on buckling under its burden, even 4 or 5 times, in other words, many times, one is still obligated to unload again, as it is written, assist, you must assist. So the purpose of the repetition is to teach us that you haven't fulfilled your obligation. If you did it once, check, now you can move along. No. Roadside assistance, you got to be there. And as long as you're there, if it needs help once, if it needs help twice, if it needs help a third time, it's all part of your literal biblical obligation to go ahead and help him once, twice, 3 times. That's the first thing that this seemingly superfluous word is teaching us, but it's not superfluous, it's not repetitious, it's there for a reason to teach us that multiple rounds of assistance are included in the obligation. Continues the Talmud, the Mishnah, if the animal's owner walked away and sat down and said, since it's a mitzvah that is incumbent upon you, if you wish to unload, then unload. In such a case, one is not obligated, as it is written, with him. So again, here we see it's seemingly a superfluous word, imo, with him. Why does it say with him? Why didn't it just say you must assist? Because the Torah is teaching us an important law, that if the owner walks off, you're no longer obligated to help. If the owner is there and he's helping you, then you have an obligation to help the owner unload his donkey. But if the owner sits down and says, hey, it's your obligation, you have to help me, roadside assistance law, I'm going to sit here and twiddle my thumbs, look at my phone. Donkeys and phones don't necessarily go together, but I'm going to sit here and twiddle my thumbs, take a walk, and go shoot the breeze while you unload my donkey. No, then you have no obligation. So in other words, repetitious wording, assist, you must assist, and with him, they teach us important details of this obligation. And how do we arrive at these details of this obligation? Through this method of Midrash, which is called ribun umiyot, textual exposition, analyzing additional or seemingly superfluous or repetitious words in the Torah. And the Talmud is chock full of these examples. That's really what the Talmud is all full of, and we'll get to that a little bit more next week. But really, the Talmud is full of these Midrashic, Halachic Midrash. And that's what we spend hours doing when rabbinical students or rabbis sit and study Torah. This is what they're studying. They're studying how the rabbis deduced various details from the written text of the Torah. And this is just one example of textual exposition. Now we're going to move on to a different law, to understand the third method that we will be addressing today. And once again, if anyone has any questions or isn't following up until now, please put it in the chat box, let me know so we can go over it. What's the third method that we're discussing today? Called hekesh or gzeira shava or smichos, the association method. What does that mean? That means when the Torah chooses to associate law A with law B, this tells us that we can apply whatever we know about law A to law B. And there are a number of ways that the Torah uses to indicate an association between two laws. One way is called hekesh. Smichos. We'll start with the last one. Smichos means juxtaposition. That means, simply put, if in the Torah we have it in, I don't know, say chapter 11 of Deuteronomy, that's what we're going to be discussing today. Chapter 11 of Deuteronomy, verse 18, it says one thing. In verse 19, it's talking about a totally different law. And in verse 20, it's talking about a third entirely unrelated law. The fact that God chose to put these three laws, one following another, means that there's an association between the three, and there are laws that can be deduced and applied from 1, 2 to 3, and so on and so forth. That is the first form of association, is juxtaposition. Another way is the use of similar wording. In other words, if by law A, the Torah chooses to use a certain word, and in law B, which could be in an entirely different book of Torah, right? In law A in the book of Genesis, and in law B in the book of Leviticus, but both of these laws contain within them the same exact word of asher. So now we know that we associate law A with law B. Now it's important to note that when it comes to Gzeira Shava, when it comes to the association of the same word, of similar wording, that is only laws that were received by tradition. In other words, sages, even of the Mishnaic era, of the Midrashic era, couldn't have created such an association on their own. They couldn't have said, hey, we find in law A in the book of Genesis and in law B in the book of Leviticus a similar wording, so let's apply the laws of law A to law B. No, it had to be, we've received from our teachers that there was an association of similar wording in law A and law B. Only this method of association has to be, of similar wording, has to be one which they have received through tradition. It's not one which they can create on their own. We'll touch upon that a little bit next week. But either way, let's get back to this law, this method of association. So what's an example of method of association? I said before, we will go to the example of the book of Deuteronomy. And which mitzvah? The mitzvah of tefillin. And not just the mitzvah of tefillin, the mitzvah of studying the words of Torah, and the mitzvah of placing a mezuzah, which are all in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 11. Let's have a look in text 10, page 73. What does the verse tell us in Deuteronomy? Chapter 11, verse 18, 19, and 20. The verse reads as follows: set these words of mine upon your hearts and upon your souls. Bind them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be phylacteries, tefillin, between your eyes. Teach them to your children, to speak of them when you sit in your home and when you travel on the way, when you lie down, rise up, write them on the doorposts of your home and on your gates. What are these verses talking about? The verses contain within them 5 mitzvahs, 5 commandments. The first one is the mitzvah to study Torah. Second one is the mitzvah to put on tefillin. Third one is the mitzvah to teach Torah to the young, educate the young. The fourth one is to read the Shema both morning and evening. And the final mitzvah in these 3 verses is the mitzvah of mezuzah, right? So let's go back. What does the verses tell us? Set these words of mine upon your hearts and your souls. Bind them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be phylacteries between your eyes, which is tefillin. Teach them to your children, the mitzvah of teaching Torah to your children, to speak of them when you sit in your home and when you travel on the way, which is the Torah study. When you lie down and when you rise up is the Shema. And finally, write them on the doorposts of your home and on your gates, the mezuzah. But now let's take a closer look at the verse that tells us about the mitzvah of tefillin. Right? What does the verse say? Bind them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be phylacteries between your eyes. Let's look at the 2 pictures right here on the screen on the left. The picture on the left, isn't that a literal reading of the verse? Bind them between your eyes. And let's look at his hand, right? Just over his hand, his actual hand, not his arm or his bicep. On his hand, we see that box of tefillin. Isn't that a literal word reading of the verse? Isn't that how we should be putting on tefillin? But now let's look at the picture on the right. This is the way we actually do it. We put it up on our head, on our here, over our here, and then we put it on our bicep facing our heart. Why? Where do we get it from that this is the way that tefillin should be worn? The verse seems to say that we should do it. What's shown here is the incorrect way. The answer is we know this by the association method. And let's have a look in the Halachic Midrash quoted in text 11. It's a little long, but bear with me as we travel through it, and it'll open our eyes to a fascinating insight on how this method, the association method, works. The Midrash says as follows. On your hands, is on page 75. The verse tells us on your hand, which means on the upper arm. Says the Midrash, but perhaps it means literally on the hand. The Torah therefore teaches us by stating in the first part of the verse, set these words of mine upon your hearts. We are speaking of a place that is aligned with the heart. What is aligned with the heart? The upper arm. So what does this first paragraph of the Halachic Midrash tell us? It tells us that using the association method, we know that on your hand does not mean on your hand literally. It means on the upper hand, the upper arm, the bicep facing your heart. Because the fact that the beginning part of the verse tells us, set these words of mine on your hearts, that means to tell us by association that what's coming next has to be associated with the heart. In other words, on the part of the hand opposite the heart. So what do we see? Utilizing the association method, we know the placement, the correct placement of tefillin. Now let's move on to the second verse, the second paragraph. On your hand. This is the left hand for a righty. We'll get to that in a moment. But for, right, where does a righty put on tefillin? Not on the right hand, but on their left hand. You say, continues the Midrash, that it is on the left, but perhaps it is the right. But we know this from the juxtaposition of the two verses. Bind them and write them, right? Verse 19 says bind them, and verse 20 says write them. Just as the writing of the mezuzah is done with the right hand, so is the tying of the tefillin done with the right hand. The fact that the Torah juxtaposes the writing of the mezuzah and the tying of the tefillin, so just as the writing is done with a person's dominant hand, so too the tying must be done with the dominant hand. So how does a righty write? With their right hand. And so they need to tie the tefillin with their right hand. You cannot tie tefillin with your right hand on your right arm, which automatically means this juxtaposition, which is an aspect of the association method, teaches us that a righty puts on tefillin on their left arm. And so where does a lefty put on tefillin? On their right arm. Because a lefty writes with their left hand, automatically means that is the hand with which they need to bind the tefillin. And if a lefty is using his left hand to bind tefillin, he cannot bind tefillin on his left arm. It's just physically impossible. I mean, it's workable, but it's not practical. And so therefore, we know that a lefty binds his tefillin on his right arm, and a righty binds his tefillin on his left arm. And that's actually the law till today. That's how it's done. Righty is on the right hand, lefty is on his left, righty is on the left hand, lefty is on the right hand. Now let's move on. The third paragraph, between your eyes, right? Where should the tefillin be? Between our eyes. So shouldn't it be just on the bridge of our nose? Meaning, says the Midrash, on the top of the head. You say it means on the top of the head, but perhaps it means literally between the lines. The Torah therefore teaches us by writing, you are the children of the Lord, your God. Do not gash yourselves and do not make a boldness between your eyes for the dead. Just as there in the case of the prohibition to tear out one's hair in mourning the dead, the phrase between your eyes means the corresponding spot on the top of the head, so too the phrase between your eyes in our verse regarding the placement of the tefillin refers to the top of the head. Here we're using the other form of association method, not by juxtaposition. What's the association method we're using over here? That is Gzeira Shava, wording similarity, similar words. In a different law elsewhere, when it talks about, there's a law in the Torah which is that one isn't allowed to pull out their hair as an act of mourning. It's a prohibition in the Torah. One of the 613 commandments is a prohibition of not allowed to pull out hair as an act of mourning. And the Torah there says you're not allowed to pull out your hair between your eyes, and it's referring to, and we know it there from other verses, but it's referring to the hair above one's bridge of their nose. So in other words, it's referring to this hair. Says the Talmud, the Midrash, just as the wording there is the same exact wording that's used here by tefillin. So just as the wording there doesn't mean literally between one's eyes, rather it means the hair right above their head, this spot. So too over here, when it's talking about tefillin, it employs the same exact wording by employing the association method. We know that it doesn't mean over here, but rather it means over here at the center of the top of the head. And so this is an example of two different association aspects of the association method, juxtaposition and similar wording, from which the Midrashic sages deduce the details of the laws of tefillin. This brings us to the fourth and final method that we will be explaining today and actually experiencing by studying an aspect of the Torah, of the Midrash. And that is alternative readings, kri uktiv, right? What's this fourth type of alternative readings? There's a popular book on English grammar that's called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, right? What does that mean? Eats, shoots, and leaves. The point of the book is to explain the importance of punctuation marks. Right? Look at this picture here. Where is it? Sorry, look at page, it's in your books. Look at page 76, right? Eats, shoots, and leaves. Eats, shoots, and leaves can either mean a panda who's sitting there eating shoots and leaves, or it can mean, right, someone who walks into a restaurant, he eats, he shoots someone, and then he leaves a restaurant. How do we know the difference between these? Maybe, how do we know eats, shoots, and leaves? What is it referring to? It's all that little punctuation, that little comma. Is it eats, shoots, and leaves? Or is it he eats, shoots, and leaves? Right? And there's so many examples of that, right? There's a famous statement, this famous meme that goes around that says, let's eat grandma, right? God forbid. No, that's not what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, let's eat, grandma. It's time to eat. All matters is the punctuation, right? Punctuation kills. That's what the meme goes, right? Punctuation kills, because if you're missing the punctuation, God forbid, they'll eat that grandma, right? Let's eat grandma. Let's eat grandma. Or let's eat grandma. So when it comes into the Torah, the text of the written Torah as it appears in this Torah scroll, not only it's written without any punctuation, it's also written without vowels. There's no commas, there's no periods, there's no semicolons, there's no colons, there's no dashes, no apostrophes, no quotation marks, no question marks, no exclamation marks. There's none of that in the Torah. But not only that, there's actually no vowels in the Torah. The 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are all consonants. None of them are vowels. What are vowels in the Hebrew language? They're these little dots and lines that are placed below, above, and inside the letters in the printed versions of the Torah, not in the authentic written Torah scroll. And not only that, even from the 22 letters, there's a few letters that can actually have different sounds. Pronunciation of certain consonants depends on the vowelization of them. For example, there's the letter shin and there's the letter sin, sh or s, right? The difference between sh and s, right? So in English, it's sh or s. In Hebrew, it's the same letter. And it's only if you have a dot on the right side or a dot on the left side. But in the Torah, there's no dots. Same thing with B or V. In the English, they're two separate letters. In Hebrew, they're exactly the same letter, bet or vet. It just matters if there's a dot in the center or no dot. And again, in the Torah scroll, there are no dots, period. Sometimes it's a B, sometimes it's a V sound. right? And here's a perfect example that it can explain us of how, confusing it can be. Now, just to be sure, every word, every sentence of the Torah has vowels and punctuation. And these have been preserved throughout history in a tradition which is as old as the Torah itself and recorded in manuscripts. And in later centuries, beginning in the end of 15th century, is actually in the printed editions of the Torah. But in the actual Torah scroll, the original parchment scrolls that recorded the other 19 books and the 5 books of Moses, only the letters, the consonants are transcribed. And this is why people who read the Torah have to memorize not just the pronunciation, but also the punctuation of the text. So let's have a look here at this screen. Where is it? Not at the screen, on page 77 on your book, which is an important point. Have a look at page, where are we holding? Here on page 77, right? Look at the first line, right? Consonants, vowels, and punctuations, which is eats, shoots, and leaves. If you had only consonants and vowels without punctuation, what do you have? Eats, shoots, and leaves. Right? So which one is it? Now, imagine consonants only in that statement. What do you have? It's not legible. Tis, 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 tis. Right? Try to make heads and tails out of that statement. And I'll give you another example. If you saw BRD, right? Those are the 3 consonants in the word that we're talking about without vowels. What does BRD spell if you were to add vowels to it? Who wants to offer to play something in the chat box? Right? Let's go. Who's going to be brave? Put it in the chat box. If you had BRD, what is the word that you can come up with if you added vowels to those consonants in that order? BRD. Anyone brave? All right, so BRD can be beard, right? B-E-A-R-D. But you know what else it can be? It can be board, which I hope not everyone here. Or, thank you, Betsy, it can be bird, right? So which one is it? Is it beard? Is it board? Is it bird? Is it bread? Is it broad? Is it, I don't know, it can be the other type of board, right? Oh, cardboard. Can be bored silly, as perhaps some of you are here in this class. So imagine a world without vowels, just consonants. When you look into the Torah, that's all you see. You see just consonants, no vowels. Which opens up to an obvious question. Why? Why is the Torah written without vowels? Why don't we have in every single Torah scroll, the scribe should also write the cantillation marks, the punctuation marks, the vowels? And the reason is very simple. Because God wanted it to remain open, God wanted it to be there for all the added layers in the Torah. Yes, there is a simple layer of the Torah, the transmission of and the tradition of, which is as old as the Torah itself, of exactly how it should be read and how the punctuation is and how the cantillation marks, which is in essence the punctuation marks. And that's why we have that tradition of how it should be read, because that's the simple meaning of the words. But then there is also the deeper layers of the Torah. And if you put vowels and you put punctuation marks in the Torah scroll, then you'd be excluding those deeper levels of the Torah. So that is why there are no vowels in the Torah, to enable us to understand all those deep levels of the Torah by various readings. So here we're going to go give an example of such a reading, right? Let's look at this verse. I'm sorry, we're going a little over time. We started a little late. We'll be done in 5 minutes. So here's an example from a Midrash. And the Midrash says as follows. It quotes a verse from Psalms. And King David says in Psalms, Yeshev olam lifnei elikim chesed ve'emes manim tzuru. Literally translated, Yeshev olam lifnei elikim means, may he dwell forever before God, kindness and truth shall be summoned to guard him. What's the simple meaning of this verse? It's a prayer by King David. It's expressing King David's yearning to be close to God. And indeed, that's the theme of many verses in Psalms. But that's only the literal meaning if we follow the punctuation and vowelization of the traditional way of reading. But when some of the words of the sentence are read with a different vowelization, or perhaps with just a different meaning, right? Because again, consonants can have various meanings to them, right? Bird, beard, broad. So consonants can have various meanings. So if we analyze this sentence with a different meaning, the result is a fascinating alternative reading of this verse. Let's look at page 80, right? Figure 2.7. Yeshev can mean, and the simple meaning is, the basic meaning is, may he dwell, but Yeshev can also mean, may it be settled. In other words, in the sense of stability and equanimity. That's what Yeshev, right? It can also mean that in English, right? Settled, there's various, can mean literally settled, he lived somewhere, or settled, the situation is settled. Olam can mean forever, or it can also mean the world, the actual world. Now, the final two words, right? Manyin tsuruhu, to guard, shall be summoned to guard him. Man, the basic meaning is summoned, but in the alternate meaning, it means who will. And yinziruhu can mean to guard him, or in the alternate meaning, it means to keep it. In other words, who will practice it? Who will keep this for eternity? Who will practice this concept for eternity? And so now let's read this verse again, using this alternate meaning. This alternate meaning means, translation A is, may he forever dwell before God, kindness and truth summoned to guard him. The alternate meaning is, may the world be settled before God, who will keep kindness and truth, which are two entirely different explanations from one passage. So the Midrash tells us that they're both true translations, they're just on different levels. Translation A is the surface meaning. It's a simple meaning. King David is asking God to guard him and to keep him close. Translation B, says the Midrash, is really a conversation that took place between God and King David. Text 15 on page 81. Said King David to the Almighty, Master of the worlds, may the world be settled before God. What was he saying? What does it mean, may the world be settled before God? Why don't you balance your world and make equal the rich and the poor? Equanimity. Settled. Even. Balanced. Why should there be rich people and poor people? Everyone should be equal. It's the age-old question. It's not just a question that King David asked God. It's a question that people ask still today, right? Economists are discussing that for years. Karl Marx came up with a phenomenal idea, which has never worked. Communism, socialism, it's an age-old question. Equality. Why should there be rich people and poor people? Let everyone be equal. King David asked this of God. May the world be settled before God. And how does the Midrash explain the second half? It's a response from God to King David. Replied God, if such were the case, who will practice kindness and truth? If all were rich or all were poor, how would there be an opportunity for human kindness? So what's God telling King David? God is telling King David, if everyone had everything they needed, no one would need anything from anyone, and we would have a world in which no one gave anything to anyone. And that is why we need rich people and poor people, in order that there should be kindness and righteousness. If there's no people that needed anything, you'd never have kindness. You'd never have acts of kindness. Acts of kindness is only when there's a void. There's only when there's a need for kindness. So in a perfect world, there would be no opportunities for kindness. And I don't want to have such a world. But why not? What's so terrible about that? Imagine a world where there's nothing lacking, so there's no need for kindness. What's the problem? And the answer is, and this will go back to the Midrash which we quoted all the way in the beginning, of kindness and truth and righteousness and right? What was the Midrash that we quoted in the beginning? kindness and righteousness and truth and peace, right? Kindness and righteousness said, create the world, because then there are opportunities for kindness and righteousness, and truth and peace said, don't create the world because humans are devoid of truth, and it's impossible to have peace because it's impossible because there's a world of strife. But this answer from God to King David explains that Midrash. In essence, what was God saying in that Midrash? And what's God saying here? Why is it a problem if there's no kindness and there's no righteousness? God created the world because God wants there to be acts of kindness and righteousness. So truth said to God, if you create the world, there's lacking truth because human beings are full of lies. The world around us is full of illusions, and, in other words, lies. So don't create the world. So in essence, what did God respond? No. Real truth is when I create a world that's full of lies and truth sprouts from that. That's real truth, not truth which needs to stay above, truth that can permeate below and still sprout from below. Which is why the verse, the Midrash that we read earlier in text 4 ends off with, let truth sprout from below. Because yes, in reality, nothingness is the most peaceful way that we can possibly imagine, right? If there's nothing, then there's no problem, there's no strife. So there's no issues. But you know what? The truth that comes from creating a world, that truth that comes when someone does an act of righteousness, when someone does an act of kindness, that truth is deeper than that which prevailed in the pre-creation nothingness, in a world where there was no chance to be non-truth, in a world and in a situation where there was no chance that there should be non-peace. And then from that world that I did create comes a situation of peace. That is a greater peace, that is a deeper peace, that is a greater truth and a deeper truth than ever was pre-creation. And this is what God is telling King David in this Midrash. That is why there must be the creation of the world. That is why the creation of the world must be through the creation of poor people and rich people, people who, and not just financially, but in everything, in wisdom and everything, there has to be that give and take, because the truth that comes through the kindness, the peace that comes through kindness and righteousness is a greater peace and a greater truth than ever was before creation. And this is employing the method of an alternate meaning in the verse from Psalms, where on the one hand, the verse means one thing, but because there are no vowels, there's no punctuation, there's no consonant, and there's only consonants, this gives us the liberty, it gives the Midrashic sages, that is, the liberty to go ahead and deduce deeper meanings of the same verse. So that is the fourth and final method which we are addressing tonight. So just to quickly recap what we studied tonight, we explored the central component, a central component of the oral Midrash, of the Oral Torah, the Midrash, which is comprised of Agadic Midrash and Halachic Midrash. And then we went through four forms of four methods with which the Halachic Midrash, which the Halachic Midrash employs to deduce and derive meaning from verses in the Torah. We gave various examples of those Halachic Midrashim. Next week, we will be learning about another major component of the Oral Torah, and that is the Talmud. And I'm really excited for that.